I'd like to share a story about Margaret, who was an 88-year-old lady who was diagnosed with a mixed dementia in early January in 2021. Margaret had lived with other comorbidities for many years, such as type 2 diabetes and renal disease, but they were always very stable. Margaret lived alone in her small flat with support from her family, particularly her son and daughter who lived nearby. Margaret had some insight into her short-term memory loss, but had declined to be given her formal diagnosis of mixed dementia from the psychiatrist. But the family were informed of the diagnosis because they actually had lasting power of attorney. So with support from the family, Margaret lived quite well with their supervision and their prompts in her medication, her personal care, and helping her with her social activities. She lived reasonably well. Later last year, Margaret's frailties became more evident, and she was needing the family to support her more and more. To maintain her living in her flat. Her mobility was changing. She wasn't as able to walk as far with her frame. And then out of the blue, during the night, one night in November, Margaret had a fall. This mitigated her to be admitted to hospital because when Margaret was picked up off the floor, she was complaining of neck pain and she had broken some of her neck vertebrae 6 years ago. So the family were a bit alarmed by this and thought it best she be checked out in hospital. The hospital decided to keep Margaret in because she was complaining of quite a lot of pain in her neck. And because of her age and her vulnerabilities, they said, oh, we'll keep her overnight. The very next morning, the family were called in because Margaret's condition had deteriorated very quickly. And it was evident that the fall had triggered off her other frailties and vulnerabilities. So she had an underlying chest infection, which they'd identified, and also she was struggling with a degree of heart failure. When the family arrived at the hospital, the doctor informed the family that they were given intravenous antibiotics and furosemide to help relieve some of the fluid. That Margaret was having real trouble breathing, very laboured, very bubbly chest. But the daughter in particular, when looking at Mum, actually thought, Mum's not going to pull through this. I wonder if she's dying. A few hours later, the daughter asked to speak to the doctor again, and the daughter herself very clearly asked, is Mum dying? To which the doctor replied, yes. So the ward suggested the family could stay all day and all night. After the second night, the family had stayed, but the son and daughter were really keen to take Margaret home to die. Nobody had come into the room to see how they were. The daughter had had to keep going out to approach staff members on the ward to help with or ask for Margaret's mouth care, changing her position, even simple things of having a wash. The family were never asked how they were feeling or dealing with what was happening. So they were quite astonished when the daughter went out of the room and said, "We want to take Mum home." That afternoon, within 5 hours of seeing a palliative care nurse on the ward, the family got Margaret home, tucked up in her own bed, amongst all her belongings, with all of her family around her, and she died just under 48 hours later at home. And Margaret was my mum, and I was the nurse. I was the daughter.
I knew what you meant. Thank you for sharing that, Sue. If it's all right, I just would like to ask just a few questions just to help us all reflect on what you've shared. So if I could start just by asking, what would you consider were the main challenges throughout your stay in hospital?
I think the main challenges was that I was the daughter, but I was, as time went on, identifying that Mum was at end of life and she was dying, and the fact that none of the professionals approached us to offer that time to talk to us a bit more about that, or they very much seemed to avoid us and just had the door shut and never came in the room. The challenge was that I felt I had to step out of my role of being a daughter into being a nurse to make sure my mum got the level of care that she deserved, and also to advocate our wishes and our preferences that we were never asked about or given a choice about.
Yeah, it sounds like you got to the point where you could no longer not put your nurse's hat on to make sure that your mum receives some support and care that may not have been there. And I'm just wondering, do you feel that having had to put your nurse's hat on, that then became a barrier for the care and support that you were describing when you said that staff weren't then coming into the room?
I think probably so, because I don't know if it was, oh, well, I don't know if they were thinking, well, she's a nurse, she knows what's happening, she can cope, she can deal with it. Perhaps that mindset. I'm not really sure, but I do, you know, if I think about the situation we found ourselves in, if I hadn't had the knowledge and my background as a nurse, then the outcome would have been that Mum would have died in hospital, without a doubt. And also, would she have been given the level of care, and would the family have been given the level of care, or given the knowledge and the understanding of actually this is what's happening to your mum? Because nobody explained it, nobody went into detail about how Mum will continue to die and what that may look like.
I
So
was
yeah.
I was just going to ask you, you described the doctor acknowledging when you actually suggested that you thought your mum was sick enough to die. And I just wondered how you felt that end of life conversation could have been better for you as the daughter.
I think I mean, he was very honest and direct in his reply to my question. But it was done in a manner where we were all just within minutes, just stood up in a room, with Mum lying in the bed. Um, you know, it may have been nicer if he'd taken us to one side or in a different room where we could have sat down and had a more of an in-depth conversation.
Yeah. Was there any particular staff that you found of support in your experience?
There was we were only in hospital 2 nights, but I quickly identified a young healthcare assistant who was on night shift at the time, and I very much linked into her because she was the only one that ever came in the room, asked how I was, actually asked about mum, who was mum, you know, and so I used to wait for her to come on night shift and ask her to help me do mum's care and change our nightie.
Do you mind if I ask, do you, in your experience, feel that the fact that your mum had a dementia diagnosis had an impact on the care that she received at end of life?
Yeah, I do. It was an acute ward, and I think the whole focus was on very sort of the medical aspect of mum's care was very much a focus. Um, you know, I was told that she didn't like to have her mouth care done. She didn't want her position changed. Um, but mum was unable to verbalise this, but there was no sort of consideration, I don't feel, about, well, or even sort of thinking about, well, why isn't, you know, if she's not liking her mouth care, if she's not liking to be changed in her position, why is that? Is she in pain? Is she uncomfortable? Is she frightened or in distress? I felt that, you know, which a lot of dementia patients display when they can't verbalize anything. So I do think that mum's diagnosis of a dementia was not really taken into consideration.
Yeah, and seeing the person rather than the diagnosis is really, really important, isn't it? And just checking out what could be the reason why they're choosing not to have care, you know, consent to care. It's really, really important. And I think you did talk about the lack of choices that you felt and the wishes that weren't heard in those couple of days that you all as a family spent in hospital. And that must have been really, really difficult.
Yes, because again, I think you would like to think that professionals would sit and ask you those questions. I appreciate they're not always easy to ask or easy, you know, how to approach people asking those questions, but not at one point where we asked, what would you like, or where would you like mum to be cared for the last few days of her life?
And it does sound like the ward hadn't even considered that possibility, let alone the conversation that could have been had. So again, you had to take off your daughter's hat and put your nurse's hat on, didn't you, to fulfill what your mum would have wanted.
Yeah, and I think that is it. I almost I started feeling I was becoming mum's nurse rather than actually being her daughter.
And they are very different roles, aren't they? Even though they are the same person,
Yeah,
they come with different emotions, don't they?
yeah. But you know, I think what you said, Debbie, about taking the lead, I think it's very much about professionals needing to take the lead because that's who family members look to, isn't it, when they're in a really difficult situation. And I think if my thoughts and emotions had been in a different place sooner, I would have had mum home at least 24 hours earlier than we got her home. And that didn't happen because nobody asked me the question until I felt in a place where I could say, this is what I want to happen.
I think as healthcare professionals, and you know, I'm sure you would agree, end of life conversations and actually trying to talk to families and support families when you do feel somebody is sick enough to die is a really challenging conversation to have. And that must have been really difficult on an acute ward as well. So I would imagine you asking to take your mum home must have caused a few shockwaves around the ward at the time.
I think it did, and I think they thought, gosh, this woman's crackers, you know, but you know, it was, to me, it was the one last thing I could do for mum. And to have her in her own bed, in her own environment with all her things that she loves with her family was the most important thing, and it needed to happen. I do wonder if, going back to having the knowledge and asking the question, if the outcome had been different and she had died in hospital, I do wonder if that would have affected our grieving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You're very lucky that you had the skills and knowledge, and there must be a lot of people on different wards that just haven't got that advocate with the same skill set that we have. And I think it's really important that regardless of what ward people are on, recognizing when somebody is approaching end of life and being brave enough to have those conversations with families, that they're relieved. Sometimes they know their person better than anybody. They may have already spotted those signs, but just not had the knowledge and skills to put the words to what they're seeing, you know, in the picture, really. So I think we need to start to be a little bit braver with conversations that we all have with our families and the people that we support moving forward. And I think from what you've shared, it's a lot of it is down to communication. And in your experience that you very kindly shared, it was lack of communication and sometimes quite poor communication that underpinned the whole experience of your mum, yourself and your brother had. So we thank you so much for sharing your experience and giving us the time to help us reflect on what maybe we could change in our practice.
Thank you.
Thank you.